If you enjoy Ship Chat or any of the other content that I create, then consider giving via Super Thanks. I understand that in these trying times, not everyone has the ability to commit to a membership, but if you have some spare change sitting around, a Super Thanks would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Right, today we are going to be looking at the Columbia class. Now, this is a ship that I quickly fell in love with once I discovered it in Starship Online, and I think it fits very well. I feature it reasonably prominently in the Tomed incident. I'll also shout out actually one of my members, Nathaniel Mead, because he pointed out that there are just so many classes of ships just mentioned in the Tomed incident that I sort of ought to expand upon it a little bit more. So that's what we're doing here. So yeah, today we're looking at the Columbia class. In terms of its origins, obviously it's a ship from Star Trek Online. Apparently it was designed by E.C. Henry himself, which makes sense. I mean, it's a very good ship, fits very well for the era. In the game, it's basically a reskin of the NX class, which, you know, I kind of get it, but also it's pretty distinct in a lot of areas. Yeah, there's some similarities. Equally, I've seen plenty of people say, and when I posted a picture of it, a lot of people say that it looks very similar to the Lochnar. Now, whether or not people would say that that's a direct rip-off, or it's just, again, convergent evolution, you know, it's very debatable. But certainly, it's in a similar spirit, although I think the Lochnar is fine and its own thing. But in terms of how it actually appears, or would appear in universe, it would probably be quite different to just being a reskinned NX, for what that's worth in Star Trek Online. In fact, we actually see that the design incorporates a lot of Oberth DNA, and that alludes to it being of a certain era. There is one more kind of behind-the-scenes fact that I will mention, and that is that it has far too much firepower. It has, looking at the torpedo launchers, you have 4. Well, that's very excessive. This thing is the same size as the NX, it's 225 meters. And it has 13 phaser batteries. Now that's pairs, that's counting them as pairs, not 13 individual phasers. Probably about 26 individual phaser nodes, but I pair them up into batteries. 13 batteries. That's a little bit excessive for a ship of this era. You know, particularly that's something that's meant to be quite small and not the most tactically oriented ship. 8 would be better, and that would cover all your flanks, wouldn't be a problem. Right, so in universe, it was developed in the 2270s along the Oberth. Basically, they're developing the Oberth. Oberth is one of the first main modular ships. Yes, you have Miranda that saw development in the 60s and entered service in the 70s. And yes, that's quote-unquote modular, but replacing the modules on a Miranda is a pretty time-consuming undertaking, and the goal of the Oberth, particularly by scaling it down so much, was to create a platform where you could very rapidly change the different modules available. And the other thing is that it's not 100% Oberth DNA. There's a little bit of prototype Excelsior DNA in there. This is where they're testing out some of the ideas and technologies that they'll be using in the Excelsior design, which is being developed. So in terms of how it was actually intended to be used, it's basically the long-range cousin of the Oberth. The Oberth is a relatively short-range vessel designed for very specific scientific missions and, you know, not designed to go off into deep space and do exploring far beyond the borders of the Federation. The Columbia definitely is capable of that. It is much, much better as a exploration ship. There's also a very deliberate homage in the design to the NX, you know. The 23rd century features a lot of very combat-orientated vessels, including the Constitution and Excelsior class. You know, Starfleet didn't want to be seen as a solely military, didn't feel like it should be a solely military organization, wanted to keep sort of that scientific element in there. And by building the Columbia class in a way to resemble the NX, they were still showing their commitment to science and getting all their funding for that. That being said, there was a little bit of skullduggery involved in that, because originally when the Columbia launched, it did not have that ventral pod. Now, people will say, oh, well, hang on, the ventral pod contains the navigational deflector. No. Navigational deflector is on the saucer. It's in that grill section, as well as the 2 torpedo launchers. It doesn't need another navigational deflector. Now, you might say that this was, again, sort of imitative of the original 22nd century NX class, which, didn't launch with a pod, but then had one added in, and that contained a new engine to give it better warp performance. But that's also not the case here with the Columbia, because you'll notice with the NX refit that the additional hull on the ventral quarters connects. Not only does it connect to the main hull, obviously by the neck, but it also connects to the nacelles directly through the pylons, as does the hull through the impulse booms. It's a bit of a mess of a design, but that's what they went for. But that isn't the case here. The pod simply connects to the main hull, which indicates that it has no connection to the nacelles and plays no role in powering the nacelles. This is not to improve warp power. This pod exists for the single purpose of housing a cloaking device. By carrying it in this outboard pod, you tie it into its own deflector system and leave your main navigational deflector free, and that is important. We will get to that. But the reason it was selected as a cloaked vessel, particularly a defensive cloaked vessel, the idea of the Columbia was that it was going to be cloaked inside Federation territory and patrol for potential threats. The reason it was chosen, and it lasted longer than the Remora, which was the Federation's first foray into doing that kind of defensive cloaked ship, the Remora wasn't very good for that. They only experimented with that. The reason the Federation chose the Columbia is because it is a scientific ship. It is a science ship. Hand on my heart, it is a science ship. But that does also give it very useful capabilities when it comes to detecting gravimetric disturbances and the other telltale signs of a cloaked ship. Now, despite this more tactical use, it's still not well armed. 8 phasers, 2 photon torpedo tubes. It's enough, and frankly, in cloaked warfare, you can get away with a lot. Its main advantage is that it is agile, and because of its profile, it is quite hard to detect. You've got to bear in mind, when the Federation intends on using the Columbia as a cloaked ship, they are aware that it has to be undetectable to cloaked Romulan ships. And there's a little bit of an arms race there. But that's something in which the Federation have an initial advantage because they start from a position of disadvantage and have to redress it very quickly. And the Romulans weren't anticipating necessarily engaging other people with cloaks. So, part of these tactics is that the Columbia was actually intended to patrol on its own. This is partially because of just sort of an issue of manpower. There aren't a whole lot of Columbias, about 16 in total. So compare that to the number of defensive cloaked ships that the Romulans had, it's far fewer. And so they needed to basically patrol alone just so that they could cover the entire neutral zone. But it also contrasts with Romulans in that Romulan tactics in terms of tracking a cloaked ship would generally revolve around working in pairs, and basically by detecting the differential between your two ships, and you'd be able to detect any anomalous readings between your two ships. Now, because of the advanced sensor systems of the Columbia, it didn't need to do that, and it also had other advantages, namely the fact that it has 2 deflectors. One is obviously engaged in projecting the cloaking field. The other one can then be used as an advanced sensor array, and that is a very, very powerful sensor array and it's basically the Columbia's secret weapon. It gives it a huge advantage when tracking other cloaked ships. And then you might say, oh, well, what if it is tracking a cloaked Nova? Well, this ultimately boils down to a key element of cloak combat. The winner of a cloak-on-cloak engagement is whoever can detect the other one first and get in a position to decloak and fire. And because of its low profile, meaning it may be less likely that the enemy detects them, and because of its agility, which enables it to move swiftly when it needs to, it can very easily decloak, get into a position to fire. And if you're a cloaked Nova, you still only need one torpedo, and that's the end of you. So the lack of heavy armament is sort of compensated for its other advantages in cloaking and detection systems. So it actually allowed the Federation to guard the neutral zone very effectively, arguably more effectively than the Romulans, with fewer ships. And I suppose that just goes to show the kinds of advantages that specializing towards science or maintaining that tilt towards scientific capability that Starfleet was able to maintain. Starfleet, obviously, in the 23rd century is heavily militarized, and we've talked at great length about how it is militarized. But it still has a focus on science, or an accommodation for science. It certainly views science as an important undertaking, in a way in which, arguably, the Romulans and the Klingons don't, or the Romulans very much kind of put science and military as two separate things. And in some ways they're almost belligerent towards one another. Obviously, the Columbia saw service during the Tomed incident, but its cloak was ultimately removed as of 2311. And to an extent it then lost a lot of its functionality, but given that everyone was sort of out of a job by that point, the Columbia actually stood in far better stead than, again, a lot of the more heavily armed ships which were very expensive to maintain. The Columbia actually continued to see service until the 2330s, and only then was it replaced by the Springfield class, which actually, again, you can see shares a fair amount of DNA, although it is considerably larger. But up until then, she continued to see use as a scientific vessel, as was originally intended. And then afterwards, it was then used by civilians. It was sold on the civilian market and quite popular. It was a good sort of long-range vessel, good for transporting colonists, well liked. So really, what we see in the story of the Columbia is the story of good, honest scientific intentions ultimately being perverted into a weapon of war. Although ultimately it is restored to what it should have always been, that being a scientific vessel, a ship of scientific inquiry and exploration, but one that was very nearly dragged into a very bloody and horrendous war. And so as a result of that, the Columbia has quite a mixed reputation, you may say. Some people love it, and other people say that it is, emblematic of the disaster that very nearly happened.